The party in British politics today that thinks we've got too much government, that government controls far too much of our lives, it takes far too much of our money in taxes, and it wastes most of it on a public sector that is bloated and increasingly is acting like a secret police. You know, whether we're running a business, whether we're going about living our ordinary lives, there is someone there. It used to be called the man from the ministry in World War II, but it's all too prevalent. So we as a party have a central belief that Britain should be a self-governing, independent nation. But way beyond that, we want to live in a country that is a freer country. We want to live in a country where we, the people, can determine our own futures. And we see the great battle that is going on in politics today as really being the battle between bureaucracy versus democracy. And right at the moment, supranational government and the bureaucrats have got the upper hand. But it hasn't got to be like this. Now, whatever we've had in terms of too much government control of our lives, we've got to say that under New Labour, the whole thing has gone completely mad. The first thing I thought to myself in '97 when New Labour came to power, and because some of you here aren't really old enough to remember it, I know, but there was the music. Things can only get better, and we had, you know, the sight of John Prescott doing a jig to that, and Neil Kinnock, and all the rest of it. Ghastly it was. But you know, Blair had come to power, and this old Labour Party that I remembered, and the last time it had been in, we had income tax rates of 83%. We had an absolutely chaotic situation with our public services and with our unions. But suddenly, under Blair, it was New Labour. It was all going to be different. There was a new brand of social democracy. And one of the big problems that Blair had in the early days was how to hold old Labour together with New Labour. Well, part of the answer, of course, was the great man Prescott himself, who was made Deputy Prime Minister, which was a great sop to the left and to the unions. But it was very clear to me in '97 that there were only really two key policy areas on which old Labour and New Labour really agreed. One was the reform of the House of Lords. That the House of Lords, it was seen to be wrong that we had descendants of the drinking mates of George IV sitting in the House of Lords, sitting in that revising chamber, and Blair thought it much better to get rid of all of those people and to replace it with a list of Labour Party donors. So that was one thing that they all agreed on, and that they did. But the other issue that perhaps is more pertinent and more relevant to your society is that fox hunting was an issue that brought together old Labour and New Labour. And the British Parliament spent, and remember, when I talk about hours and time in the British Parliament, we're not talking about a real Parliament anymore. This is not a Parliament where they sit and debate things all night. I mean, now it's a 9 to 5 Parliament. That's Monday to Thursday. It briefly sits on Friday mornings, and of course it's just finished an 82-day summer recess. So Parliament doesn't sit for that much time anymore compared with the old days. But even within those constraints, we spent over 640 hours of Commons parliamentary time discussing the fox hunting ban. And when you think that we only spent 18 hours discussing whether it was right or wrong to go to war in Iraq, it does say quite a lot, doesn't it, about the priorities of Blair's government. Well, sure enough, we finished up with a ban on fox hunting, and you might argue, well, it's not really been workable, and there are more teenage girls now riding to hounds than there've ever been, and it's become quite fashionable to join the local hunt. But ultimately, the ban is still there. And I would put forward the idea that it is not for government to decide whether you take pleasure in dressing up in red frocks and coats, drinking huge stirrup cups. I mean, I'm all for that bit personally, but you know, whether you want to go and hunt foxes or not should be a moral decision that you make yourself and not a decision of government. But sure enough, it was one of the first things that this Labour government did. The other great libertarian issue, I think, happened in the last couple of years. And again, it sums up the attitude of Blair, but it also sums up the lack of any real opposition on these issues that exists in Britain today. And I'm talking, of course, about the smoking ban. Now, I have to declare a personal interest in this subject. You know, I was a 50-a-day smoker for 27 years, so I like smoking. I've packed it all up, left it all behind me, and since February I've been smoking a pipe. I now classify myself as a non-smoker, which is a lovely self-delusion, but that's my problem and I'll deal with that. But in the 2005 manifesto, Labour said that they would introduce a ban on smoking in public places, but that private members' clubs and fee-paying organisations would be exempted. Well, when it came to pass, they've actually banned smoking in totality. So if you pay your membership fee to the local British Legion club, let's say in Oxford, you now can't smoke there. We can set up a club in London and have group sex, and that's fine. That's quite within the law to do that, but we can't set up a club in London and sit and smoke cigars. And I would have thought just the same as with fox hunting, you know, whether you want to smoke a cigarette or not, or as an ex-smoker like me, a pipe, it is not for government to decide how you should or should not live your life, and to have extended the smoking ban to even cover private members' clubs strikes right at the very heart of a fundamental principle of freedom of association. Now, you know, all of you here, intelligent, bright, libertarian-minded students will know that John Stuart Mill is the man who is often credited with perhaps defining liberty, you know, clearly. And of course Mill's idea was that liberty is the freedom of you to exercise your own rights and privileges, to do what you want to do, provided that does not impinge upon anybody else. So as far as the smoking ban's concerned, it's perfectly obvious that we should go back to the way pubs used to be organised, where we have a saloon bar that is non-smoking and a public bar for yobbos like me round the back where we can go and smoke, and then surely both sides of the argument would be happy and one would not impinge upon the other. But they're just two examples of what's happened in our life. But you know, I think where people have really felt the impact of big government is for those people out there who are working as part of the private sector that we joked about earlier. You know, we've still got something like 3.5 million self-employed businessmen and women in this country. They are the people that have really felt the weight of big government. There is this belief, there is this desire that if it moves, you must legislate against it. And now, this is not new. It's been there for some time. And there's that wonderful story, apocryphal probably, but never mind, it bears telling. Wonderful story of Winston Churchill, just after the war, standing at the urinals in the House of Commons and turning round and seeing Clement Attlee next to him and saying, "Oh my God, Clem, every time you see something big, you want to nationalise it." Well, you know, Labour were quite good at that with big businesses, but it's not the big businesses I'm talking, it's the small businesses that have really suffered. And they have had to put up with something like 3.5 to 4,000 new pieces of law that are made in this country every single year. Some are statutory instruments, some are acts of parliament, most come from what I regard as a foreign dominion, and perhaps we'll return to that a little bit later on in my talk. But it's they that have had to pick up the burden for this. But in a sense, we're all picking up the burden for it, because what is freedom? I mean, the greatest freedom, surely, the greatest freedom that we have, living in a free market, is the ability to make money, and for the government not to take too much of it from us. We are now, not through income tax, that's now down to, what is it, 50%, or will it be 55%? I don't know. Whatever it is, you can be certain of one thing: whatever Labour do, Cameron and his dimwit colleague Osborne won't oppose any of it. But we're living in a society where through indirect taxation, those of us that are working and those that are in the productive sector, which I can no longer, of course, claim to be, are paying over vast sums of money to a government machine that decides how it spends our money. And what UKIP wants is, yes, we want to live in a civilised society. We believe there should be a safety net for those that cannot provide for themselves. But we do believe that the welfare state, that the dreams of of Beveridge and all these people going back 65 years have actually gone wrong, because we finished up living in a society where living off the state has actually become an option that millions of people have chosen. And you could apply the same principle, if you like, to, common agricultural policy subsidies to farmers. Very nice to get a cheque on year one, and you feel very good about it. By year three, you become wholly dependent upon it. So I feel we're not living in a free society. I feel everywhere we go, there are CCTV cameras, and we're told, of course, that it will make our lives better, that it will stop crime, that everywhere we go, we find ourselves with speed cameras that want to stop us, and we feel increasingly that those of us that are part of this wonderful mythical land of Middle England are the ones that effectively pay the price for things. We're the people that get the knock at the door. Did you see this case of a lady at the weekend that was a Christian lady was opposed to a gay pride march, and two police officers come and knock on her door, and yet at the same time we read about those people that are serious, violent, repeat offenders who go into prison for tiny, tiny sentences and come out and do the same thing all again. So there is this feeling that law-abiding Middle England is being overtaxed, is being spied on, is being told whether it can hunt foxes, is being told whether it can smoke cigarettes, and the whole thing is completely out of control. Now, we may have a saviour, because at the Tory party conference, David Cameron stood up and said that he was going to fight and campaign for small government. Now, that sounded rather good, didn't it? And I briefly, it had been quite a heavy night at the time I saw Newsnight, and I briefly, nearly cheered, because I thought, crikey, here actually is a difference between the Labour Party and the Tory Party. And I've been going around for the last 3 or 4 years saying that you can't put a cigarette paper between them. But I thought at last, maybe there is a difference. But what did Cameron actually mean by talking about small government? Well, I suppose he did say that the Tories were going to propose spending cuts. Osborne, of course, presented this. In fact, they intend to cut government spending by the princely sum of £7 billion a year, which, of course, is less than 1% of the overall government spend. He may repeal the fox hunting ban, although personally I doubt it. He certainly has no intention of getting rid of the smoking ban, and there is no commitment from this Conservative opposition, soon perhaps to be government, to cut taxation in any way at all. But the point I want to put to you tonight is that even if we did have an opposition party worthy of that name in British politics, even if we did have a Conservative government coming into power next year that genuinely wanted to free up small businesses, that genuinely wanted to give us back our liberties, that genuinely felt it was wrong that our DNA database should be shared with a European Union centralised database, that felt that all of these things should actually be taken away from Europe, should be taken away from central government and given back to us as individual human beings, even if we had a government that genuinely was committed to those things, I'm afraid that right now it wouldn't be able to do it. And of course, the point that I'm moving on to is the fact that we are members of a European Union. Now, older members in the room may have had the opportunity to vote on this in a referendum way back in 1975. I myself was far too young to vote in that referendum, and most of you here weren't even born. But the fact is that over 75% of our laws are now made by the institutions of the European Union. And the point about European law, which gets right to the heart of the whole principle of democracy, of freedom, of us as a people being able to determine our own future, is that once something is European law, there is nothing we as voters can do ever at any subsequent general election to change that law in any way at all. You know, right now there's a big debate going on about the hedge fund directive. You might have read about it. Now, perhaps you all think that people in the city are greedy, awful, terrible people. Well, perhaps some of them are. I did my best in 20 years to be one of them, but didn't succeed because here I am now. But whatever you think of those people in the city, you know, we've got to recognise that it's one of the few things that we as a country are still very, very good at. And the penny is beginning to drop with these city businesses because they are beginning to realise that this investment directive will probably be law by Christmas. The European Parliament may amend it ever so slightly, the Council of Ministers may make one or two demands, but it will be law by Christmas, and then, if you're a hedge fund manager in the City of London, it doesn't matter a damn to you whether Gordon Brown or Call Me Dave becomes the next Prime Minister, because there's nothing they can do to change even the grammar. Nothing they can do. So the whole point about those of us that want to live in a low-tax society, that want to live in a society where government does less, that want to have a government that gets rid of excessive regulations that control our daily lives, that gets rid of the kind of regulations that prevent entrepreneurs, that stop people from going into business. The whole point about this is the only way we can achieve any of this, libertarians, is by voting in British governments who pledge to do it. But the only way we can have British governments that can make that pledge is to have British governments that have that power back. And all the while we remain part of a political union and a customs union that is called the EU, there is absolutely no chance of this massive degree of over-governance that we're all suffering from and that all of us hate ever being reversed. So we can talk until the cows come home about all of these things, but I want us free of a European Union. I want us to be trading with Europe, to be friendly with Europe. I want to vote for British governments that deregulate us. I want to have British governments that give power back to local councils. You know, Mrs. Thatcher, she so hated the extreme left that she emasculated local government in this country. But perhaps the greatest freedom of all that we can have is I really do think that the Swiss system of direct democracy is a damn sight better than the current form of parliamentary representation that we have in this country. And one of the things that we're going to push at the next general election is the idea that we should have direct democracy in this country. That if enough people sign a proper petition demanding a referendum on a key issue, they should be able to have it. And I would put it to you that that would be, in democratic terms, the ultimate freedom. You know, we've got a first-past-the-post system that has given us a set of political parties sitting in Westminster that are now virtually indistinguishable from each other. I've been talking about this cigarette paper that you can't put between Cameron and Brown and who's the Lib Dem chap? He's so boring, I've forgotten him. Clegg. You can't put a cigarette paper between them, and I've been using this as a form of insult over the last few years and blown me down if Cameron doesn't write in the Observer the other week as a boast. You can't put a cigarette paper between us and the Lib Dems. We finished up with politics in Britain that is dead. And it is dead. We've got a parliament that doesn't legislate. We've got increasingly people that don't go out and vote, and we've got a state, both at local, at national and at European level, that is controlling every aspect of our lives, is taking away from us our ancient freedoms and rights, replacing it with a human rights culture which frankly I value as meaningless. And post the Lisbon Treaty, all of these great issues of freedom, all of the great issues of morality, no longer will those things be decided here in this country by our courts, but they'll be decided by a political court based in Luxembourg. So I'm with you, all of you in this room that want less government, that believe in liberty, that believe in freedom of choice. I'm with every single one of you. I want those things too, but until we cut the Gordian knot of European Union membership, none of it will actually be possible. Thank you very much. The other big problem, of course, is overheated buildings in this country, public buildings, including this room. And I thought we were all concerned about climate change and global warming. So why we do it is quite utterly beyond me. Well, thank you. You were a very polite audience, very nice audience. You gave me a much better reception than Mr. Griffin got last week on question time. And just before I move to questions, just something I'm curious about. I just want to ask you a sort of show of hands. How many people thought that last week's question time will be good for the BNP, and how many people thought, because of what Griffin said, it will be bad for the BNP? So how many here thought that him being on question time will aid and abet the BNP in their mission? Hands up. And how many thought it would hurt the BNP? You pretty much split down the middle, actually. Interesting, isn't it? I have to say myself, in '99, UKIP won 3 seats in the European Parliament. And because of that, Question Time invited me to appear on the programme. Now, it wasn't met with quite the venom that Mr. Griffin's appearance was met by, but it was met by considerable comment in the press that UKIP shouldn't be on this programme, that they were only in the European Parliament because of PR, and that Mr. Farage represented a very extreme view, only held by a tiny percentage of the public, and therefore it wasn't relevant and wasn't right that I should appear on the programme. And the truth of it is that actually, it's not just been Question Time, but actually appearing on Question Time and all of those programmes is perhaps the biggest single factor that has helped propagate our views, that has helped to make us popular, and help the party to expand and grow. So for us, the first invite to Question Time was absolutely key, because people thought, who are these people? What do they stand for? Well, hopefully, the things that I've said on that programme haven't been too crassly stupid over the years, and people have seen, whether they agree with our view or not, that we are sort of a half-decent, well, only half, but, a half-decent bunch of people. My view on Griffin is that I think to those that put their hands up to say that it's been good for them, that short term, they've gained publicity that to buy would have cost many millions of pounds. There's absolutely no question about that. But I personally think that 4 or 5 of the answers that he gave were so simply appalling. I mean, the Holocaust stuff, the Ku Klux Klan. That was top stuff, wasn't it? An almost totally non-violent organisation. And then he has the cheek the next day to say he was a victim of a lynch mob. I mean, goodness gracious me. The comment on the Muslims amused me too. He said, anyone pick this up? He said, if Muslims choose to continue living in Britain. Is this after Griffin's taken over? I just thought there were 4 or 5 comments there that were very, very damning, and I believe whatever short-term boost the BNP may have got from it, I think that to have got on a programme of that stature and to have said things that were as crassly stupid and ignorant as he did, I think in the medium to long term it will do them enormous damage. And I think that there are the number of hardcore, genuine racists out there, and they do exist. I've met them. I've been out canvassing. I've met them on the council estate. I mean, people that absolutely hate everybody. Love and hate tattooed on the knuckles and all the rest of it. I mean, there is a constituency for it, but it's actually very small. And that most people who vote BNP in council by-elections do so because they want to stick a massive 2 fingers up to the establishment, because they feel bloody angry about open borders, about the extent of immigration, the pace of immigration, and all of these things. And they vote BNP without ever really subscribing to what the party is about, or in the back of their minds might be all about. And I think that Griffin the other night removed any suspicion. Anybody that thought that guy perhaps genuinely was a moderniser, on thinking about that programme last Thursday, would realise that all of that baggage is still there and is still in place. And to say that he couldn't explain why he'd said what he said about the Holocaust because of European law was a pretty poor excuse, wasn't it? That was the one good contribution from Jack Straw on the programme. God, I kept looking for one, But the one good contribution from Jack Straw was when he said, there is no law in this country that prevents you from talking about the Holocaust. So I think they were damned by last week. I hope they were damned by last week. I genuinely think that this year's European elections will prove to be the high watermark for the BNP and for their policies. Anyway, enough from me. Right, now questions on what I've said, please, far away. Someone throw abuse at me. So.
You mentioned question time.
Yeah.
Some BNP votes would be ill-informed anti-Europe votes. Would you have liked to have been on the programme to try and point out, you talk about how people aren't racist, but it's a protest, sort of highlight how you're a protest vote that is not a racist one?
Do you know, the week before, I was on the programme the week before, and up in Hull, a Labour stronghold, interestingly, in which UKIP came first in the European elections. Amazing. One of those cities where I never thought UKIP would come first anywhere in the country, all the years I was working for it, but suddenly, in a European election context, we are. I came home from Hull that night, thinking to myself, God, I'm really pleased that I did this week and not next week. And now I think quite the opposite to that. I now wish I had been on that panel. Two reasons for that. One, a very cynical reason, that it was an audience of 8 million. All right, okay, I'm being honest, so it would have been a big stage. No, I'll tell you the real reason why. I felt the rest of the panel dealt with it really very, very badly indeed. It was completely formulaic, wasn't it? They all walked in with their notes, and they plunked their notes down in front of them, and they read out from pre-prepared scripts, and they didn't really adapt to Griffin and what Griffin... Nobody could have predicted that Griffin would give answers as crassly stupid, ignorant, and, no, I mean it, and as ill thought out as he did. I mean, the Holocaust question was an obvious... listen, when I go on Question Time, every time I go on, I think to myself, what are the 3 worst things that Dimbleby's going to ask me? He'll ask me about a couple of our MEPs that turned out to be rotten. He'll ask me whether I drink too much. Well, that's true, obviously. But, what are the 3 worst things that I'm going to be asked? And that's part of the preparation. Griffin didn't go through that process. But the others were so formulaic, they were unable to respond, they didn't move from their scripts. I thought Jack Straw, frankly, his performance was absolutely pathetic. And the best contribution of the evening actually came from a black guy in the audience who said the only reason Griffin's on this panel is because of total failure of Labour's immigration policy since 1997, and he, to me, was the star of Question Time on that evening, because he got it completely spot on. So I now wish that I had been on that programme, and I had been able to say that we as a party, yes, we're patriotic, but with a small p, not with a capital P. We're nationalist, but with a small n, not with a big N. We believe in proper immigration controls, and we don't think that the population moving to 70 million by 2020 will be a good thing for this country in any sense at all, but we do so absolutely from a non-racist, non-sectarian perspective. It's what we've always been. They've tried to brand us in the past as being something different, but yes, sir, my answer is, I wish I'd been on that programme with him. I would like to think I'd have been a bit fleeter of foot than some of the rest of the panel. What do you think? No comment. Okay, fair dues. Yes, sir.
How optimistic are you about your chances in the general election against the Speaker, and how is the campaign going in general?
Okay, the Speaker, the great Mr. Bercow, the man that had planned since 2001 to become Speaker of the House of Commons, and of course by definition, anybody that really covets a job in public life is the wrong person in the first place. And that's why this great tradition, of course, of the Speaker being dragged from the chamber reluctantly to the chair. This man had plotted it all along from 2001. My view is, without being too personal about it, but my view is that Bercow represents all that is worst in politics today. That's very personal, I suppose. But most peculiar chap, doesn't come from any sort of great privileged background, and now sort of walks around speaking as if he's John Gielgud. It's quite extraordinary to listen to him, it really is. I think Bercow is a political fraud in every sense. He planned to be the Speaker. He cynically dropped all of his old policies, and one or two, like the Monday Club, perhaps he ought to have dropped, because the Monday Club of 1985 that he was a member of make Griffin look quite moderate. So maybe there's one or two aspects of growing up that were a good thing, but he very cynically gave up all the things he believed in, became New Labour, became Blairite. He was on the board of the Bruges Group at one point in time as a Eurosceptic. Then he backed Ken Clarke for the leadership. Then he speculated in public that he might join the Labour Party. And then, lo and behold, it's the Labour MPs that vote him in as Speaker. So I think that he doesn't represent political principle. I also think that as a Speaker of the House of Commons, who has set himself up to be a modern-day Speaker, he's going to tour the country, Bercow. in his built-up high heels, and he'll tour the country talking about Parliament and democracy and how important it is that we reinvigorate Parliament, when at no moment in time will he even mention the fact that even before the Lisbon Treaty goes through, that 75% of our laws are made somewhere else, and he won't even talk about it. So I think there are many good reasons for me to stand in that constituency. There, of course, won't be a Labour candidate, because they've virtually got a Labour MP already. I don't think the Lib Dems are going to stand. There'll be all sorts of eccentric candidates that do stand in the by-election. And of course, I mean, here's me saying that. Just a quick sort of tangent, if I can. UKIP was formed in September 1993, and I was a founder member of it. And 6 weeks after the party was formed, I turned on the radio, 6 o'clock in the morning, Today programme, to hear the news that the Conservative Member of Parliament for Eastleigh, one Stephen Milligan, had been found dead overnight. And this was the famous story of dressed up in women's clothes with the sort of ligature thing round the neck and the orange in the mouth. I mean, it may be normal practice to some in the Libertarian Society, I don't know. I chose to call it the first ever case of vitamin C poisoning. So UKIP had been going for 6 weeks, and I stood in that by-election. I was UKIP's first ever candidate for a completely unknown party. And I got a few people together, and we designed a leaflet, and we went out and sort of gave out these leaflets, and I turned up on the night of the count, and it one of those big Lib Dem sweeping wins from a seat that had been Tory forever. And I'm proud to tell all of you that in my first ever attempt to stand, I beat Screaming Lord Such by 198 votes. Not a bad start. Not a bad start. So who am I to criticise eccentric candidates that come from nowhere? Now, I think the Buckingham thing will be a simple two-horse race. I think amongst those people in the constituency who are switched on to politics and care about these things, I'm going to do incredibly well. And there was a big poll on Conservative Home not long ago that showed that a vast majority of Conservative members who contribute to Conservative Home would in fact prefer to vote for me in the privacy of the polling booth than vote for John Bercow. Beyond that, what can I say? I'm going to give it my best shot. I don't know. There is a massive Conservative majority there, but they voted for a Conservative. They got somebody who actually betrayed the principles that he said he was standing for in 2005. I don't think he's a very popular Speaker of the House of Commons. I don't think he's a very popular man amongst his own constituency party. He, of course, will try like hell to maintain his position, but I'm going to give it a go. More broadly, how will UKIP do in the general election? Well, I just don't know the answer to that. You know, what we have proved is that we can do damn well in a European election where there is proportional representation. And I do feel proud of the fact that I led the party on June the 4th to coming second in the entire United Kingdom. And that's not bad for a party that just scraped past Screaming Lord Such a few years ago. I mean, seriously, it is some achievement. Can we replicate Hull? Can we replicate Newcastle-under-Lyme? Can we replicate Plymouth and those places where, in the European elections, we came first? I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that UKIP's growing, and I think the evidence for that was the one electoral test there's been since the Euro elections was the Norwich North by-election, you know, where we scored a similar kind of percentage in a first-past-the-post by-election that we clearly couldn't win, as we've done in the European elections. I think UKIP is growing. I think UKIP is more united than it was before. I think people's fears about UKIP, you know, was it somehow a more extreme organisation wearing different clothes? I think all of those things have now been allayed. And I think the politics of independence from Brussels, the politics of direct democracy, the politics of less government, the politics of more freedom of the individual will manifest themselves over the next few years. Whether that's through UKIP or some successor organisation, I don't know. But I do feel confident that at least in terms of public opinion, the tide has turned. Okay. So.
Nigel, the subject for this evening was the growth of the state and how to shrink it back. And I recently joined UKIP for two fundamental reasons. Number one is being against big government because of the fundamental reason as to how it shrinks our freedoms. But the other practical reason why I joined is very simply the enormous and horrendous cost of big government, both in this country, and you referred to taxes against small business, and the cost of EU big government. Now, in your talk, you've spoken about the first aspect and my first concern, but I don't think you've really addressed the second concern, i.e. the cost. And this is perhaps more of a comment as opposed to a question. And the comment or question, if you like, is inasmuch as many people vote with their pocketbooks, as it were, do you not think it would be a better policy for UKIP to focus at least as much on the cost, the real cost of big government, both big government in this country and the EU, so as to appeal to those who may not be of a mind of the libertarian society and who tend to think more in terms of their pocketbook?
Yeah, look, I mean, politics operates on different levels, doesn't it? I mean, the kind of debate we're having here tonight is not the kind of debate that we have with the general public, because the general public is not as switched in or as intelligent or as good looking as the audience that we have this evening. But in terms of cost, we've tried for years in UKIP to talk about the cost of European Union membership. The cost of the membership fee, the cost of the regulations, the opportunity cost of not being able to have our own free trade arrangements with parts of the world that we choose to do so. And we've tried all of those things, and we might win some of those arguments in a debating arena like this. We might lose some as well, but we might win some. What none of that does is to resonate with the general public. So what we tried this year in the European elections was something different. We tried to quantify the cost, and I was a big advocate of this, and we test marketed it. We did opinion polling on it. We even did some focus groups. No, I'm not Dave Cameron, please, but we did some focus groups on this. And we found out that the trouble with talking about costs was, firstly, nobody understands what a billion is, or 10 billion, or a trillion. It just doesn't register with ordinary folk. So the first problem you've got is to speak in a language they understand, and the second problem you've got is to use figures that are actually credible and believable. Because in an electoral war, you know, both sides chuck about figures, spurious figures, and claim and counterclaim, and the public finish up not believing any of it. So what we did this year, very simple, but I think highly effective. I know highly effective. One of our three main themes for the European election was, this is costing you £40 million a day. Right? And we used it in national newspaper adverts. We used it on 25 million leaflets to go into every house. And we used it on big billboards, including Oxford. You know, the EU is costing you £40 million a day, vote UKIP. So effective was it that I now get people, cab drivers, people on trains, who come up to me and tell me, do you realise this is costing us £40 million a day? so there you are. It's about simplicity, it's about credibility, it's about believability, and it's about repeatability. So we got that right. The £40 million a day we got right. Now, just to bring you all up to date, it was £40 million a day in the run-up to the European elections. It's gone up. It's now £45 million a day. And last Thursday, as I sat in the European Parliament in Brussels, they voted for a new resolution which is yet to be ratified by the European Council and is reported in today's Daily Telegraph. But they've now voted that from next year, Britain's contribution must go up to £50 million a day. Now, you know, economists amongst you will say, well, this is small beer. This is only 1.2% of our total, you know, gross government spending per annum. But hey, it's a figure that sticks in people's minds, and it's a figure in a time of crisis that resonates. So that's one of the problems, sir, that politics operates on a variety of different levels. But what I do want UKIP to do, and we're not there yet, but I do think we have to come up with a policy at the next general election, a credible policy on government spending in this country, and a very clear plan to radically, over the next 5 or 10 years, reduce the amount of government spending in this country. But we can't do so with immediacy, or we do face the risk of what Japan went through back in the 1990s. You know, Japan got herself in a mess. She slashed government spending. Demand in the economy went down. She was stuck in a cycle of deflation and was stuck there for 10 years. So I think we have to come up with a policy for the general election that says big cuts in government spending, allied to the policy that Mervyn King is using at the moment, the quantitative easing policy. It's called printing money. It's not actually printing money, but it's providing liquidity in the markets. Now, the critics of that say that it might lead to inflation. But I think the short-term fear of debt deflation is very much more serious than the fear of any inflation to come in the future. The second thing the critics of Mervyn King's policy say is that it's making the pound weak. Well, thank God for that. And I'm not saying that just because I'm paid in euros, though I am. I'm saying that because, as an exporter, that's a very good thing. And it's very interesting. I'm going off subject here, but I'm enjoying myself, so I'm going to continue. But if you go back to the last, major economic credit disaster of 1929 to 31 and onwards, interesting that when Britain crashed out of the gold standard in 31, it was generally accepted that Britain was in such a desperate state that she was now finished, and not just her economy was finished, but probably her democracy was finished as well, and that Mosley or whoever else would sweep the board. And actually, because we were the first out, and because we were able to devalue, 5 years later, it was the other European countries, or within 5 years, it was the other European countries that were totally busted, and they not only had lost their economies, they'd lost their democracies to fascism as well. So I am hoping, as far as Britain's concerned, that not joining the euro, that having had this 25% devaluation in our currency, having a Bank of England that now appears to have reasserted itself over the government. Alistair Darling is not running the quantitative easing programme, please believe me. I doubt he can even spell it, And I do think that Mervyn King and the Bank of England have got it right, but I do think UKIP needs to come up with a credible policy on what to do about government spending, but with the caveat that we have to couch this in terms that ordinary folk understand, and £40 million a day was a winner, and our next election campaign will say it's 50, and that'll be even better. Sorry, the next one was there. Yes, sir.
A couple of weeks ago, the hot topic was the leaders' debate between the different parties.
Yeah.
I remember you saying that you'd like to be a part of the panel. How big would you like the panel to be? Would you like the Greens and the BNP to be on it as well, so you can really get to grips with Nick Griffin and the other parties properly?
Well, the trouble with this is I think, look, any questions on Radio 4 is a panel of 4. And they have 3 people from politics and 1 from, business or the arts or whatever else it may be. Question time, when it was Robin Day, gosh, this is ancient history, isn't it? But it used to be 4. They made it 5 by bringing on a celeb. And I have to say, very often the celebs are very weak in my view. The first time I appeared on it in 1999, I was on with Benjamin Zephaniah, the Rastafarian poet. And in those days, you could smoke in the green room. So I was having a gin and tonic and a smoke before going on. And he was chatting to me. I said, "Do you want a cigarette?" Benjamin said, "No, I don't smoke those sort of cigarettes." But anyway, he appeared once and never appeared again. Was Bonnie Greer good the other night?
No.
I don't think her contributions were very powerful, really. Nice lady that she is. I've met her a couple of times. Nice lady that she is. So question time has become 5. Before the European elections, they increased it to 6. And I appeared on the question time on May the 28th it was, the week before the European elections, with 6 of us on a panel. Well, 6 people on a panel show that, including the music and the credits, last for 58 minutes, and you suddenly are beginning to get sound bites. Whereas the point of question time surely is that you have a bit of a debate and a chance to expand an argument. So I think that whilst I think that the BNP should have been on, and perhaps they'll appear again in a couple of years, and whilst I think the Greens should appear on these things, I feel the Greens appear far too often on these things, because they're nice, and the BBC like them. No, I'm being serious about this, in Oxford, I could be lynched in Oxford, of course. This is their great stronghold for some reason. Everyone's gone mad in Oxford, but never mind. But no, I generally think that actually, if you have a panel discussion with more than 4 people, it starts to get very, very difficult indeed. And tell you what, back to that Griffin question earlier, I tell you the programme that he should appear on. I've done it twice. Andrew Neil's Straight Talk. Now, it's a programme that doesn't get a mass audience, and it's shown at 4 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. But my word, you sit in front of Andrew Neil, and it's 28 minutes, straight through, uncut, and the camera is on you the whole time. And he's firing questions at you, difficult questions at you for 28 minutes. That for me, that's the toughest and most rigorous test I've been through in politics, under examination. And if Griffin gave some bad answers on question time, 28 minutes with Andrew Neil would really sort him out. Yeah.
You talk quite a good talk.
Well, thank you.
Nice. But, I mean, ultimately, UKIP aren't going to get into power. Your European representation is never going to be more than, say, 20 max. Why is it not a wasted vote for you in a general election?
Well, I think one of the first things in a democracy is that you should be able to stand up and fight for what you believe in. And if what you believe in is quite different to the entire political class today, then you should stand up and fight for it, even if the odds appear to be against you. So that's the first reason we should stand. The second reason we should stand is because there's more than one way of winning. Look, what do we want? What is it? Why have I come out of business, out of a lucrative career in the city, to do? Was it Alan Duncan described it as being sort of menial pay? Well, it's not menial pay to most people out there, but certainly to me it's menial pay compared to what it was before.
It was rations.
Rations, wasn't it? That's right. Well, he was an oil trader. He had far more than I did. So, why have I done it? I've done it because I believe in this. I really, really believe in this. I want my 4 children to be able to grow up in a country that they can call their own. I believe that our future is a global future in terms of economics and in terms of relationships, and not just a European future. But there's more than one way of winning. We've got 3 ways. There are 3 ways of us winning our independence. One is that we form a UKIP government. That may appear to be unlikely to you, and I would accept that on May the 6th next year, I don't see there being 331 UKIP MPs. I mean, you never know, but I don't see it, and I would concede that to you here, and as I would anywhere else. But that's one way of winning. The second way of winning is because our arguments are winning with the general public, and no one could deny that. When I first got involved in this was real minority sport stuff. Not many people out there thought that the European Union posed a threat to their ordinary lives, and it's now, and we've been the only people saying it, it is now the clear, settled majority view of people in this country that we want to trade with Europe, we want to be friendly with Europe, we want to be good next door neighbours, knowing with the French that won't always be the easiest thing to do, but we don't want to be part of a political union. So the second way that we win is that by winning hearts and minds amongst the public, that we get one or more of the other major parties that steal our policies. And this happens. I mean, the One Nation party in Australia, Pauline Hanson, the fish and chip shop owner from Adelaide. She formed a party in 1990. She won 10% of the national vote. John Howard took over effectively the Conservative Party in Australia, stole every single policy from her. She disappeared, but she'd won, didn't she? Because we had 4 terms of John Howard with those policies. And the third way that we can win is because of the pressure and because of the threat that we pose to both parties in the marginal constituencies, that they throw their hands up in horror and they give us, the British people, a free and fair referendum on this issue in which we vote, I hope, to do the right thing. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, there's more than one way to win, and somebody has got to be out there fighting and making these arguments. And look, you can say it's a wasted vote, you can say it's impossible, but believe you me, when I was having a drink with Lord Such, having soundly thrashed him by 198 votes in the Eastleigh by-election, nobody then would have thought that UKIP would have gone on in a European election to being the second biggest party in the country. So we've come a long way. Politics is changing, and it's changing very, very fast indeed. Trust in the established parties is breaking down. We could finish up next May with a hung parliament.
So would you consider it a success if you got the Tories to adopt a strongly Eurosceptic policy?
I would consider it a success the morning that I wake up knowing that we have freed ourselves from political union and we are once again a free, independent, self-governing nation. How we get there doesn't bother me. You know, I'm not tied, you know, UKIP isn't sort of stamped through the top of my head, even though I've given the best part of my adult life towards it. The reason that I give UKIP what I give it is because it's the only effective vehicle that I've got to push and fight for the things that I believe in. If UKIP didn't exist in 5 years' time, I wouldn't be heartbroken. What I want to do is win, and it's the issues that matter.
Yeah.
All right?
What's the UKIP policy on drugs? Is it
You've really got me now.
is it important to UKIP and electorally? Do you think it's important to the country more generally?
All right, what's the UKIP policy on drugs? Well, the UKIP policy on drugs is the same as all the other parties, that drugs are appalling and terrible and we must be tough on drugs. I mean, that's
That's a libertarian.
That's more or less what the party policy is. What's the Nigel Farage view on drugs? Quite different. I say this as somebody, and I've drunk and smoked all my life. I've never dabbled with drugs. I've never chosen to. But that, I guess that's by the by. But I never have. And I discourage my sons from doing it. I'm sure they ignore me, but I discourage them from doing it. I mean, they're at university, or one of them is anyway. So I don't know. But look, I take the view that if you add up the amount of police time, if you add up the amount of court time, if you add up the cost of prison, if you add up the cost of all of this, and then you add the cost of petty crime and not so petty, unpleasant crime that is going on to raise the money for people to buy drugs, and then when you accept that drugs are so endemic that it isn't just walking down the commercial road in the East End of London that you're offered them, but in North Cornish hamlets, that you realise that the idea every year that the government announces we're appointing a new drug czar and we're going to launch a war on drugs. This was lost many, many, many years ago. And I have had the impression over 10 years as an MEP, God, I'm a veteran, but over 10 years as an MEP, one of the things that I have seen at first hand that I wouldn't have understood in my own life before that was visiting various council estates and rundown areas where the lives of thousands of people are blighted by, in each case on these estates, less than a handful of people who run the drugs rackets and all the extortion and all the unpleasant things that go around with this. It's not that I want to legalise drugs, it's that I want to take away the criminal incentives from those who use the fact that it is illegal and need to get the money to buy them. And frankly, my own view is that we'd be far better off lifting this prohibition, accepting that perhaps more people would use them, but working on the principle that people should be able to go to the devil in their own way, and cutting out the whole criminal class, just as the Americans, in the end, cut out the Al Capone class by realising that the prohibition of alcohol was a total disaster. I haven't yet. I've managed to modernise UKIP in certain ways, and I've managed to broaden UKIP, and it doesn't look like a party of very angry old men, which it did 10 years ago, with the exception of me. I was an angry young man. And we've broadened the party out, and we've got a much broader appeal, and I have managed to change policies on certain things. This is one that I've not been brave enough to take on with my own membership, but that's my own view. What do you think?
Well, I think I agree with all the arguments for legalisation that you said, and it doesn't seem consistent to me with a libertarian outlook to try and ban it, but also what's the difference between smoking a spliff or having a cigarette? Which one's really more harmful? So
we'll test both later. Okay.
On a similar vein.
I was joking. Don't quote me about anybody that does that.
You must
I don't mind generally what I think. Everything else I've said you can quote, but not that. Please.
Well, you must have known, I suppose, that a few of these questions would be coming as you're addressing libertarians, but I suppose you've had the drugs question. You mentioned earlier that, of course, people can engage in group sex on their own property. This is not, in fact, the case. Well, that's the interesting way that it so happens that brothel laws and brothel prohibitions are defined.
I will bow to your experience on this.
Well. The point, the point is that money does not have to exchange hands between participants for it still to be classified under, I think, a disorderly house criminal definition. Would you support the ability of people in the privacy of their own venues and homes to be able to engage in whatever sexual activities they desire?
Oh, Lord.
Adult.
No, I hadn't expected that one. I think you may be wrong, actually, because I don't think the disorderly house rule would apply to a fee-paying private members' club.
I see.
So if we, you know, and if my next entrepreneurial venture, having failed in the general election, as this gentleman here so kindly informs me, and if I set up, you know, the Farage Group Sex Club somewhere in central London, and you pay £100 a week to be a member, or a year, or whatever, depends on what new car I suppose. But then I don't think that, and that wasn't a pun, but I don't think that would be a disorderly house. Because that would be right of association by private consenting adults agreeing to join a club. So I think it's different when you pay to go in, you know, on a one-off basis. I think that we have an opt-out from that, okay? That the British have an opt-out from that, the Poles have an opt-out from that, the Slovaks have asked for one, and Václav Klaus is about to get one at the summit this Thursday, all right? But in effect we always know that opt-outs are nothing more, really, under European law than sort of time-delayed derogations. And in the end, there's going to be a battle of wills. You know, forget the Brits for a moment. Think about the French and the Germans. A battle of wills between the ECHR in Strasbourg and the ECJ in Luxembourg. And I think all of us that have watched this process over years know which one's actually going to win. The Charter of Fundamental Rights sums up human rights to me, because it all looks absolutely terrific. You know, it gives us the right to life. Well, that's nice of them, isn't it? The right to marry. Well, it works out for some people, not always me, but there we are. And all of these things. And then Article 52 says that in time of emergency, all of these rights can be abolished. So it's not worth the paper it's written on.
It's quite an extreme.
Well, you read it. Well, you read it.
It's only in extreme circumstances.
Well, hang on, son. Hang on. Who defines what's extreme? Who defines what those circumstances are? That's the point about this, isn't it? That's the point about this, is that you give over to the organs of the European Union the ability themselves to decide what the circumstances are in which, you know, the state of emergency can be declared and all those rights can go. I would argue that I would prefer, we as a party would prefer, and think it generally better, to live with a system of freedoms as opposed to rights, i.e. that every man or woman is born free, that everything is legal, unless there is a law that prohibits a certain action, as opposed to the opposite of that, which is the Human Rights Code, which means that actually you are only allowed to do those things that the state allows you to do through the rights that they give you. It's a big battle of rights versus freedoms, and I generally think, I believe, that our liberty, freedom-based system, our common law system, our judicial system that backs all of that up, you know, the presumption of innocence before guilt, habeas corpus, all of those things, I think those things are an infinitely better safeguard of our liberties and freedoms than any human rights, government decreed system. And I hold very strongly to that view. I don't believe human rights have made the world a better place. So.
With regard to lobby of the booklet, on the tax page you say you want to make tax simpler, and then on the picture with the road you talk about reducing a British thing. How are you going to actually go around imposing this British tax, and surely is it not going to get passed on to consumers?
Well, there are two separate things there. So quickly on the British thing, there is no doubt about it that our road haulage industry has suffered at every single level. We've got this sort of terrible discrimination against our own people here on the grounds of... the last time the police did a spot check on the Kent motorways, over 50% of the lorries from Eastern Europe were seriously breaching safety regulations, buying cheaper fuel. So we're talking about just redressing the balance on that. But the bigger picture, as far as tax is concerned, look, nobody has... I talked about the old Labour government last time round, 83% income tax for the high paid. What Brown has done is to so massively complicate the tax system. I mean, God knows, you know, tax credits, I mean, the employees don't understand them, the employers don't understand them, and none of it's working. And what we're arguing is that where the flat tax system was introduced in the Baltic states and other countries like that, it worked remarkably well, it incentivised people, but above all, the one thing that I've spoken about in the past, and I want us to campaign on very seriously, I talked earlier about the welfare state and about it being a lifestyle choice. But it's actually not a lifestyle choice for everybody. You know, I've got a cousin, she's 30, husband's buggered off, you know, left with massive gambling debts, the house has been repossessed, you know, she's now been put in council accommodation, she's got 2 young kids, I mean, she's in a hell of a state. Lives in Hampshire, she applies to the Inland Revenue, who've got a big office there, she gets a good job, because she's well qualified, and it's quite a well-paid job, but actually, because of all her benefits, and because she'll start paying tax from a very low level, she's better off, far better off, and will have time for her children in not taking that job and staying on benefit. A glass ceiling has been put on her and her aspirations. That is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And I believe, and this will be in the UKIP manifesto, that nobody should be taxed if they earn less than the minimum wage at a 40-hour working week, which is about £11,500 a year. Let's lift the threshold at which people start paying tax, and let's incentivise people to get off state benefit and get back to work, all right? So, you know, all these different bans, all these tax credits, all these paybacks, it's not working. There's a huge bureaucracy. We could sack tens of thousands of civil servants involved on taxation by simplifying the whole thing. I honestly believe it would work. All right? So.
For those who argue in favor of EU membership, what do you think is their strongest argument?
Well, it used to be the economics of it, but they've lost that now, because they know that British business has sussed that access to the marketplace is not worth the regulations that come with it, especially given that countries outside, like Switzerland and Norway, have the same market access without the same additional cost. So they've fallen back on the only argument they've got. They've fallen back on the thinking from Jean Monnet onwards that was behind the project, and just like communism was, or Soviet communism was, you know, it's very often the case that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. All right? Imagine if you were French. It's a very difficult thing to do, I know, but imagine if you were, you know, and 1945 comes along. You know, you've just been through 2 catastrophic, disastrous world wars. One in which your country has absolutely ripped to shreds, and another in which, you know, the psychological damage that's been done to you by the cohabitation with Vichy and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, and if someone comes along with a theory that says, if we have a union with Germany, there'll never be another war, well, my goodness me, you can see that's a very tempting idea, can't you? Very tempting idea after what you've been through and after what Europe had gone through. So that was the original thinking behind it, and now, in any debate on EU membership, they will always fall back on, well, of course, we need the EU because it guarantees the peace. All right? Now, my answer to that is this, that if, without the consent of the peoples, you take away from them their democracy, their identity, their ability to determine their own futures, that if you do that to them, far from creating peace, you are far more likely to stir up all sorts of civil disorders and potential problems for the future. And the best example I can give you of that is the thinking that happened post-Versailles with the Treaty of Paris in 1920, when the great and the good said, look, we can't have all these ridiculous little Balkan countries with their own tin pot princes and their own parliaments and their own currencies, and this is absolutely hopeless. We can't have them going around shooting each other, causing world wars. we've got a solution for the Balkans. We're going to call it Yugoslavia. And we're going to give them one currency, and one government, and one flag, and one anthem, and one army, and once we've done that, there'll never be war again in the Balkans. Well, they might have held it together under communism and Tito, but once it had gone, and once he'd gone, we've seen things like the Srebrenica massacre. We saw Kosovo just last year declaring its own independence, and nobody would be brave enough and bold enough to predict that we hadn't seen the last of problems in the Balkans, as they now fight and are prepared to die to get back the states they had pre the Treaty of Paris. You can only federate. You can only do these things with the full-hearted consent of the peoples involved, and in this European project, that has been absent from the very beginning. They've never told us the truth about any of this, and even when people in referendums have the temerity to vote no, they're told they've got it wrong and they're asked to vote again. Not a recipe, sir, I would suggest, for peace and harmony long term.
At a practical level, what do you see as the best strategy for a party like UKIP? Is it, in fact, to try to influence the national government through national elections and attempt to effect withdrawal from the EU? Or do you think there's something to be said for cooperation with other Eurosceptic parties within the European Parliament to attempt to dismantle the mechanisms of power of the EU internally?
I cooperate with the other Eurosceptic group, the other reasonable Eurosceptic
and
groups.
Second part to that question, which sort of parties, anti-immigration, regional autonomy, green, whatever parties do you see the UKIP having most in common with?
Look, I cooperate, have done for nearly 11 years in the European Parliament. I cooperate with other Eurosceptic groups in that Parliament. But it's becoming increasingly hard to do so. Because what's happening is the reaction to this, and it's back to the last question, the reaction to this is becoming increasingly extreme. It's becoming extremely, I could, align with the Greek Communist Party. I mean, they're more anti-EU than I am, but I'd rather not. Certainly, and there's nobody in this room who's a libertarian that would either. Equally, I don't find the Hungarian Nationalist Party, Jobbik, who've got their own sort of brown shirt uniform, particularly attractive either. And that's the problem. People feel their identity is being taken away. People feel their democracy is being taken away, and they're tending to move to the extremes. Luckily, there are still sufficient people that we can work with as UKIP, and I'm now leading a group in the Parliament of 33 MEPs, and yeah, we'll work with them, but in reality, we're not going to win this or get this changed in the European Parliament. I mean, the mechanism there doesn't exist. The single most realistic way that we win, and it's back to this question here, but the single most realistic way in which we win is for our arguments to command such a tidal wave of public support that a British government has to give the British people a referendum so that we can decide our own future. And I tell you this, provided it was a free and fair referendum, and that is very important, particularly after the monstrous behaviour in Ireland recently by the broadcasters and the yes silent, but I mean, let's not go into that too deeply, but if a majority of my fellow Britons decided that I was wrong, decided they wanted to live in a new United States of Europe, I wouldn't like that. But I'd be prepared to accept it, because that decision would have been arrived at democratically. But what I am not prepared to accept, and why I've packed up a career in business to come and do all this nonsense, is I'm not prepared to accept a group of utterly gutless, spineless, useless career politicians in our two main parties who've led us up the garden path on this for over 3 decades without ever having the courage to tell us the truth about their intentions or ever consulting me. I've never been asked to express my opinion on this, and I will fight against the so-and-sos as long as I can. If the British people don't want it, I can live with it. I won't like it, but I'm not having it done to me just by politicians. And that's my main motivation.
What do you think the future holds in store for the British Union?
Good question, and in many ways, the European argument and that question are closely interweaved and interlinked. As far as Northern Ireland's concerned, Northern Ireland is the most Eurosceptic place in the world. Jerry Adams makes me look like a Europhile because he's a genuine Irish nationalist. He wants the island of Ireland to be independent, not governed by the British or Brussels or anybody else. Paisley certainly has a view on this. I mean, in Northern Ireland, on both sides of the divide, they know what sovereignty is. So, Northern Ireland, fiercely Eurosceptic, and the current relationship that we have with Northern Ireland will maintain. Wales, well, the first UKIP MEP was elected in Wales earlier on this year, and I wouldn't say that Wales is quite as Eurosceptic as England, but not too far away. And what's being done to Welsh sheep by the European Union after January the 1st is nobody's business. I won't go into it. The Welsh and sheep and all that is too much, isn't it, even for your society. Scotland's the problem. Scotland's the problem. Because they've been fed a completely false agenda by Alex Salmond. God knows how he's got away with it. But this idea they can be an independent state away from Westminster and yet part of the European Union is a non-starter as an idea intellectually, isn't it? Either they want independence for Scotland or they don't. We've yet to have this debate. It is possible. It is possible, as things look now, that a national referendum on Britain's continued membership of the European Union could result in a Northern Irish, Welsh and English collective quite big no vote and a yes vote in Scotland. So we could see this issue being the one upon which the union with Scotland gets broken. And I don't say that with any glee. I don't say that because I want it to happen. But I do feel sorry that the Scottish argument, that the whole Scottish debate, that the word independence in Scotland means something that frankly at the moment isn't quite true. And I do think also that Salmond's economics don't add up and don't make any sense at all. So I don't want to lose Scotland, but I do think the English have not had a very good deal out of our relationship with Scotland, and that does need to be redressed. So I can't answer it. I haven't got a crystal ball, but a referendum on EU membership would bring that very sharply into focus. Now, a couple more. Yeah.
During the run-up to the last European election, did UKIP make a silent decision not to compete directly with the BNP?
No. No, not at all. In fact, what we did in that European election was we campaigned on three things. We campaigned, number one, on the 40 million quid a day, which I talked about earlier, which was highly effective. We campaigned, number two, on the need for a referendum on this issue. Sadly, we slightly lost that one because Smoothie Boy, ex-PR man, called me Dave Cameron, was able to say, vote for us and we'll give you a referendum without actually being challenged as to what that meant. And we'll find out after this weekend that, in fact, it wasn't worth a row of bloody beans. But anyway, and the third thing we campaigned on was that we believed that it was quite wrong, irresponsible, to have a total open door to the whole of Eastern Europe. That did not make sense at a time when we've had a massive oversupply in the unskilled labour market since 2005, but we did that making it absolutely clear that we were a proper, non-racist alternative to voting for the BNP, and whilst our philosophy is entirely different to the BNP on trade, on economics, on social and liberal issues, on virtually everything, whilst our policies are entirely different, there is a vote there that wants to protest in some way, and I think we did well, and frankly, if we hadn't been around, they'd have won many more seats than they did.
I'm not saying your policies are anything like the BNP.
No,
but
sure.
Clearly the voters, the people who vote for anti-Europe, are going to vote for the BNP or UKIP. So, for example, and in a city like Manchester, it was targeted very heavily by the BNP, and there was no presence by UKIP.
Well, that's nonsense, isn't it?
I'm not saying that you campaigned on the same issues. The three issues you just said you campaigned on are different from the BNP, but you did target different areas.
Well,
and was that a silent?
When you're a voluntary organisation, yeah, and you build a voluntary structure, you effectively can only target where you're strong, where your voluntary structure is strong. And I would concede one point to you, which is in Manchester we're weak. You know, we're much stronger in Liverpool, but in Manchester we are weak, and there are different reasons for that. But look, in the Northwest, I mean, we fought a very vigorous campaign in the Northwest. We won our first seat in the Northwest very comfortably, and the last result of the night that came in was the Northwest. And with a quarter of an hour to go before the result, I was on the blower, and it was 50-50. Would UKIP win the second seat, in the Northwest, would our 27-year-old, who would have been the youngest British MEP ever, win the second seat in the Northwest, or would Griffin got it? And by just a few thousand votes across the entire Northwest, Griffin got it. I accept your point about Manchester. You know, we are a voluntary organisation. The BNP have put roots down in places like Manchester. It's our job to overturn them. I think we have seen the high watermark of the BNP. I genuinely don't fear them after his performance last Thursday. Right, now time is getting on. We've been kicked out in 5 minutes. How many more questions are there? 1, 2, 3. Well, let's take all three, and I'll attempt to do them all. So, number one.
Could you say a bit more on why you think that direct democracy, so giving more people power, would decrease the government? So isn't it a bit that less people in power, like in monarchy, result in less people being employed by them?
Well, look, the point about, you know, we've talked a bit tonight about this, and this phenomenon that our parties in Britain have become the same. They look the same, they sound the same, they marry each other's girlfriends. I mean, the whole thing's extraordinary. Their policies are identical, and they're all quite happy with the fact that 75% of our laws are made somewhere else. We don't get an opportunity to express our opinions on where we're governed from, on who comes to live here, on any of those things. I see the ability to call referendums as the only effective means that people have to get round the back and, in fact, in the end, to destroy the current political class. All right? Number two.
I'm wondering if you could tell us something about UKIP's policy, which I see nothing about, on the right of civilian self-defence. Whether you support reinstating our 1689 Bill of Rights, right to carry arms and use them against criminals, and whether you oppose the Big Freeze war on cutlery.
Oh, the what?
Cutlery knives.
Ah, right, sorry. Yeah, well, I have to say that I'm somebody that regularly travels carrying 8-inch sharp knives. This is because I'm a fisherman, and they're in, I'm sure if the police stop me, I'll probably be in some terrible trouble for it. Look, the balance between what is right and sensible to defend your own property, indeed, the balance that is right for a teacher to maintain rule in a classroom, and a very interesting case on this in the last few days. I mean, the whole thing's gone loopy, hasn't it? Would I advocate the right for us to walk around carrying guns? Not sure I would, because I think in America, the fact people do carry more guns means there are more deaths from guns. It's just as simple as that. But would I beef up and give people the right to defend their own properties against intruders? Yes, I would. The biggest problem we had with this was Tony Martin. You know, the Tony Martin case 2001 was the celebrated case, but of course it turned out that he was a bit of a nutcase. Well, no, he was. I mean, he was sleeping up with a shotgun. He was waiting for them. He couldn't wait to blow someone away. So Martin was a very bad example of it. Haig briefly backed him. And then thought, oh my goodness me, what have I done? And it was a bit of a mistake. I mean, we all make mistakes. So, look, the balance of the law is wrong. We should be able to defend ourselves. We should much more vigorously be able to defend our property. But would I advocate the right to carry arms openly in public? I don't think I would. I think it would lead to more deaths than we've got. Last question. We've got 2 minutes left.
Okay. You said that we have a massive oversupply of unskilled labour.
We have had, yeah.
Wouldn't it be far better to let the market decide that mistake?
Yes, the market does decide it. What it does is two things. Firstly, it forces virtually everybody down to minimum wage. It also, of course, encourages a black market where people get paid less than that in cash, and that's been happening wholesale across this country. Think of the cockle pickers that died on Morecambe Sands as a classic example of that. But what it also does is it means that whilst the employer may have reduced costs, and we have to accept, you know, that wage inflation over the last 5 years would have been worse than it had been if we hadn't had the oversupply. All right? I mean, I fully accept the economics of that. Weigh against that the cost of hundreds of thousands of people going onto the unemployment register that didn't necessarily need to go onto those registers, and you'll see that Britain's had a very bad deal out of it. Listen, I'm perfectly happy to have a proper work permit system for people from Poland. I'm perfectly happy to issue 6-month work permits or 1-year work permits or whatever it may be. What I'm not happy with is the open door and the oversupply of unskilled labour leading to unemployment. That doesn't make any sense. And what I'm not happy with is that after 12 months of working here, that people have the automatic rights of settlement. You know, I had afternoon tea today with the son of a Ugandan Asian, and they've probably been the most successful migrant wave to Britain in the whole entire history of these islands. I mean, they've produced more millionaires, more entrepreneurs, phenomenal. But you know, when the Ugandan Asians came, in total there were 27,000 of them. When we opened the door to Eastern Europe, we had something like 1 million in the first 3.5 years. It is about numbers, it is about being sensible, it is about recognising that we simply haven't got the infrastructure to cope with these vast numbers of people, and that at a time of rapidly rising unemployment, we need to be sensible about this. Of course we don't want to stop people coming here who've got skills. That wouldn't make any sense at all. But an oversupply in the unskilled labour market as a result of our EU membership has not been a good thing for very many people, and has fuelled the very resentment that has given Griffin a toehold in the Northwest and on Question Time last week. We've run out of time. We're going to be kicked out of here in 2 minutes' time. Listen, can I say thank you very much